In the waiting room of the midwife's clinic, beneath the hum of a fluorescent light that always sounded a little like rain held in a jar, and next to a rubber plant that had decided to grow a crooked leaf perfectly level with my belly, I slid a pamphlet from the rack and felt the odd texture of its paper, the way cheap gloss can still hold fingerprints and a history of anxious thumbs, and I turned it over between my hands as if it were both a map and a mirror, a set of directions for muscles and bones, and also a reflection of the crowded, shimmering fact of a new life. And on the second page, under a stock image of a woman with a serene half-smile, I found a title so plain and resolute it might as well have been a bell rung in a small chapel of breath and blood. Stretching and mobility exercises for pregnant women. I traced the period with my eyes as though it were an instruction all its own, a tiny dot telling me to pause, to stop, to hold the air in my chest for just a second longer before letting it go, and in that stretched, elastic moment I thought of how language tries to name what changes us, even when we can barely say what the change feels like from the inside. The word mobility on paper meant angles and joints and ranges of motion, diagrams, a graph of possibility measured in degrees and carefully labeled axes, yet sitting there with my hips warm and heavy from the slow, deliberate walk from the bus stop and the buzz of the city rinsed into a distant murmur beyond the clinic's double glass doors, it meant something else entirely, something like a model of time where each moment is permitted a little more space. Each memory is allowed to elongate until it touches what comes next, and the future returns the gesture. As though life itself were a sequence of measured reaches, gentle and hopeful, toward what we cannot yet hold. And I thought of my grandmother's kitchen where her laughter creased the air, like ribbon, and of the doorway where my mother marked my height with pencil on spring mornings. And I thought how everything that mattered had always been a kind of reach, a generous extension of the self toward another point, another person, another possible version of the day, and how the smallest acts, pouring water with care, tying laces with patience, turning the page, were their own forms of mobility, the body reminding the spirit that motion is not only about leaving but also arriving. When I was younger, I ran until the cold stitched its tidy ache along my ribs and my calves wrote long sentences against the pavement, and on those evenings I mistook speed for power, rhythm for meaning, my lungs negotiating with the sky in a language of steam and effort. But now my strides have softened into something measured and attentive, a carrying pace that listens to each footfall as if the ground were speaking and I had finally learned to answer. And this shift, this deliberate reduction in velocity, has not felt like a loss so much as a refinement, a narrowing of aperture that admits more light, so that I noticed the moth asleep on the bus shelter at noon, a smudge of velvet with a secret map on its back, and the woman at the bakery who tilts her head when she hands me change as if to make space for a thank you to nestle somewhere more comfortable. And I have started to imagine my body less as a machine to be tuned and tested, and more as a narrative, an unfolding arc of sensation and care through which my child will soon begin to read the world. And it occurs to me that perhaps the most honest definition of mobility is the one that lets you travel toward yourself without fear. At home, where the afternoon stands in long ladders of light across the floorboards and the kettle sighs like an old friend remembering a story to the end. At last, I set the pamphlet on the table and smooth it flat with my palm as though calming a restless thought, and I notice in the notes I took during last week's class how some phrases look like boats cast out onto a margin of white, how certain bold words behave like small lighthouses, promising that even modest guidance can be enough when the fog comes down and the day blurs. And there, half an inch from a coffee ring, a phrase waits in its compact certainty. A caption under the sketch of a woman leaning toward a wall with one heel pressed to the ground. Wall calf stretch. Reading it, I do not think of angles yet, but of the layered meanings that nest in the simplest words, how a wall can be a border or a support, how a calf can be a muscle that sings with quiet endurance or a creature wobbling into the first steps of its life, and how stretch more than a mere measure of length can be an invitation to become a bridge between what has been and what is about to be. And I find myself touching the kitchen wall absent-mindedly, and feeling not the cool paint, but a silent, steadying answer, a permission to lean, to trust balance where I used to demand certainty. My partner, who measures time by the smell of onions caramelizing and tunes our evenings to the tempo of a wooden spoon tapping the rim of a pot, passes by with an armful of assembly instructions for the crib and a grin he keeps forgetting he is wearing, and he nudges the door open with his hip and says something about screws and tiny hex keys and how the instructions say to prepare for 2 people, as if the furniture already understands what we are practicing. And I laugh longer than the joke deserves because it feels like points of light are being added to the sky inside our apartment, because even the mundane promises a choreography of togetherness. And while he spreads the pieces on the floor with the seriousness of a cartographer, I press my hands to my lower back the way my mother did and let my weight pour backward like a tide. And I feel the calf muscle hum, a note that I interpret not as pain but as clarity, the simple revelation that even a muscle has a memory and a desire. To lengthen, to let go, to be part of a shape that makes sense. On Tuesdays, I go to the community center, where the floors smell faintly of varnish and lemon. Where the class meets in a bright room raftered with kindness. And we arrange ourselves on mats that scuff a little under our socks. And the instructor, whose voice is a quilt of gentleness, stitched with good humor, speaks of breath as if it were a friend who comes to visit every minute. And she reminds us that this is not a rehearsal for some perfect performance, but a way of listening. A way of translating the whisper of ligaments and tendons into a decision to be softer with ourselves. And I am struck by how every woman in the room carries a different story, how the geometry of our silhouettes says less about symmetry than about wonder. And we smile at one another like neighbors leaning over fences to offer the ripest tomatoes. And between the laughter and the slow, patient reaching, I feel the first intimation of a community that is not founded on shared expertise, but on the grace of believing one another's bodies, of believing our own. My mother calls in the late afternoon, when shadows are briefly longer than their objects. The old magic hour, when truth sometimes slips out without apology. And she tells me about the day she went into labor with me. How a storm rolled over the fields and turned the power out, so that the radio sang without electricity as though it had a battery of its own heart. And she says she remembers holding the doorframe with both hands and breathing as if the air were something to haul in with ropes. And she laughs at herself for the drama. While I imagine it without irony and think that maybe everyone misremembers the hardest days as tales too grand. Because there is no other way to make sense of the fact that we keep living through the impossible. And I tell her the names we are considering. The ones that sound like rivers and constellations, and the ones that sound like rooms full of books, and she listens in that quiet, steady way of hers, a kind of listening that is itself an act of guidance. And when we hang up, I find that the pamphlet's dumb little dot, at the end of its title, has become in my mind a punctuation of blessing. Walking home from the corner store where the cashier saved me the last cinnamon bun, as if it were a small ceremony and not just a happy accident. I took the long way past the park and watched a pair of kids teach each other to skip stones, their faces looking compressed with concentration and then exploding into awe as each rock caught its first bounce. And I thought of how instruction is sometimes just a matter of standing near and offering your own warmth, how technique can be a laugh, a nod, a growing confidence. That you can ask the water to let you pass. And the water will agree. And down the block an old man was stretching his shoulders against a chain-link fence before the evening walk he takes every day, and he nodded at me with a solemnity that turned the sidewalk into a church aisle for a second, and I nodded back, feeling the city as an organism composed of small flexible rituals, a place where strangers bend and sway in parallel without noticing. And it occurred to me that these weeks are an apprenticeship, not in contentment but in capacity. Not in learning a set of rules but in practicing the art of yielding to good change without fear. Even the apartment has started to feel elastic, as if waking each morning with a new willingness to rearrange itself around our unsteady excitement. And the mirror has taken on a kinder angle, and the chairs consent to be moved a little way from where they have always stood, and the windows rehearse the trick of receiving more light at odd hours. And in the bathroom, I catch my face in a strange expression of concentration, as if I were trying to solve a polite riddle posed by the sink, and I realize that this unnameable posture is anticipation, pure and ungilded. The way the body becomes a listening device pointed toward what it loves. And I write a few lines in my notebook for the child to read much later. Lines about how I hope they will learn to trust what they know and question what they are told and dance without permission on rainy days. And I tell them that strength is a conversation and not a verdict. That love is a set of small, repeating gestures refined over years and perfectly timed to no one's clock but our own. Sometimes late at night, when the apartment is a ship creaking at its moorings and the sky outside is crowded with the ghost voices of televisions turned low, and the far hum of traffic sounds like a choir repeating one long note, I stand near the wall and let my heel settle the way a word finds its root in silence. And I imagine this not as a lesson in flexibility, but as a way of saying thank you to the body that brought me here. A body that has carried and carried and carried and now astonishingly carries another. And I imagine the baby listening from their deep warm world, hearing the slow language of my breath and the thud of my heart like the oars of a boat rowing toward the first light on the horizon. And I tell them in a whisper that the future is not a test, and that we will go gently through it together. And in the moon's thin stripe across the kitchen counter, I see the pamphlet's edges glowing as if they had absorbed some small measure of the day's courage. On the bus the next morning, a woman with silver hair and the posture of someone who has practiced kindness for many years offers me her seat. And for a moment, I want to decline in that old impulse toward independence, which I have learned is sometimes a refusal to be in relationship. And then I remember how the act of accepting help is itself an extension of the self, a reaching beyond the closed circle of my own comfort. So I thank her and sit. And we exchange a few sentences about the weather and the shape of clouds that morning. Clouds like pages turned slowly by a child. And I think about the ways we stretch toward strangers and become briefly larger than we were, making room for the shared breath of a city. And when I get off at my stop, the day feels freshly primed, like a canvas gessoed and smooth and ready to receive whatever brushstroke waits in my hand. The pamphlet waits on the table when I return, and I place it, at last, in the drawer beside the family recipes and a photograph of my parents a week after they met. Their smiles, a pair of parentheses, trying to hold as much as they can. And I realize that what I needed from those pages was never a program or a schedule or an achievement I could check off with a date and a time, but a tone, a note to hum under the errands and phone calls and meals, a steady key in which to play the mutable song of these days. And I think about how every stretch of muscle, of patience, of imagination has taught me to locate the tiny hinge where effort and grace meet, that silver bracket where intention relaxes into acceptance. And as the apartment swallows another evening and the neighbors' laughter pitches up like swallows returning to the roof, I feel it again, the quiet lengthening, the subtle increase in my capacity for this tender astonishment. And I close my eyes and picture the map of tomorrow, unrolling like a ribbon, I don't have to pull, only follow.